always makes me nervous. Right. Okay, I'm just going to say a few things about trauma to see if we can kind of locate it in all these different layers and realms that we live in. And first of all, not think of trauma on its own, but think of us living a continuum, really, between trauma on the one hand and resilience on the other. So we're never just traumatized. We're always, and an organization is always, and a country is always somewhere between the two, coping on the one hand with things that have overwhelmed and contracted the capacity of the system, and on the other hand, having all sorts of capacities, as all of you have got, and all of the places that you work with have got, to somehow find a way of bouncing back, of not being destroyed, of carrying on, of still valuing life even when difficult things have happened. And since the history of, since Adam and Eve, really, we've always been bouncing between these two. We have, in a sense, understood that both belong together. They hold hands in the great scheme of things. And we're always working towards increasing our strength and range and releasing it from some of the sort of tightness that comes with trauma. And we need to think of trauma, whether it's personal trauma or organizational trauma or national or ecological. Really doesn't matter which field we're looking at, but trauma occurs when the coping strategies are overwhelmed. That's all it means. You know, we're designed at every level to manage challenges and threats. And we do, you know, on the whole. And every now and again, so we do it, they're difficult, they occupy our attention, and then we rebalance ourselves, we come back again. There are some things that don't finish fading. And some of them are kept alive because what happens after keeps them alive, you know, so that the conflict in the Middle East or the conflict in the former Yugoslavia and so on is fed by myths and stories that require acts of loyalty to our ancestors that make it absolutely impossible for trauma ever to come to an end, because we are always avenging somebody who actually is, it doesn't benefit from it because they're dead, usually, just to put it bluntly. So as we near trauma, in whatever level we're looking at it, whether it's our organization or ourselves, the first thought we have in a healthy system is we don't like trauma, we don't like what's going on, and we resist it. We argue against it. We fight it in one way or another. We bring our active resources to try and stop the trauma from being difficult. You know, so we go and we fight in the streets, or we send letters, or you see what I mean? We have a huge range of ways of not collapsing, but acting in the face of something difficult. Sometimes we don't have enough forethought about whether it's useful to do it, you know, so there's a lot of impulse control needed if you're going to get into fighting. If we can't do that, we withdraw. That's a much more demanding activity, withdrawing, because it feels like failure. It's often an incredibly creative, wise thing to do, to turn away, to recognize this isn't the time, to keep myself safe, you know, to run like hell, actually, often. to leave an organisation where it's quite clear it isn't going to function, to leave a country where it's quite clear never going to be safe. There are ways in which we can stay alive and vibrant and healthy by reducing our connection with the trauma. That's built into our systems, that we can do that. So we can resist, we can withdraw, we can run. But when those things are not possible, because somehow the context is too rigid around the situation, then we are in trouble. The organization's in trouble and we're in trouble, because we have a huge amount of sensation and data coming our way. It's very chaotic and we can't act. So we do something else which is built into our systems to do, which is to reduce our sensitivity to it. We dissociate, we desensitize ourselves. And probably if we didn't, we'd be in very serious trouble. But we are in some serious trouble because we do, because a creature from outer space, if they were coming to visit us now, looking at how we're dealing with this climate crisis, would say we are in a state of mass, tranced, numb dissociation. So it's a strategy that isn't altogether helpful when the situation really requires action. Because while we're dissociating, usually the factors that create trauma grow. We hand it to them on a plate, really. So we freeze, and when we freeze and we dissociate, we really, really mess up our nervous systems, and we mess up the nervous systems of the organizations that are involved in this. They stop transmitting information, or they have a lot of cross wires and the information arrives as a trauma, but it's about something entirely else by then. So we are no longer fed by this flow of vitally helpful information in our bodies. And it means we're then open for much more damage. You know, we'll say yes to things that are extremely dangerous for us, for instance, or we will allow a bank balance to wander into bankruptcy. You know, there are ways in which this kind of numbness, it's not a feature of an individual, it's a feature of a situation. There are some situations where numbness does seem to be the only way you can go, because after that, the last two strategies are the ones that we're, this is why I started thinking about it, because the next strategy, which people don't talk about so much, is a form of clinging. You know, Stockholm Syndrome type of thing. You identify with the people who are hurting you. And if you're a proud boy, you identify, you join a group that gives you a feeling of power. So it's an absolute haven of opportunities for very, very powerful right-wing responses, which are a way of not having to be in this place of incompetence and dissociation and wanting to run away. As soon as you've joined a powerful group, all of that goes. So that's what Hitler did, obviously, in Germany. It was just phenomenal how people ran into Hitler's arms for that strength, because they were so battered and lost. And if even that doesn't work, then of course that's it, we die. You know, so the suicide rates are very high at the moment, and particularly in certain populations. They're much, much higher than they were even 10 years ago. I don't know the exact details, but you can see that in a country where, like England, where we have dealt with the pandemic by allowing very, very large numbers of people to slip out of every net into homelessness and into food scarcity and into, everything. Frightful, really. Death is an understandable option, and it is one that's being taken. So you're looking at a spectrum of strategies, and you've got to know, you've got to be able to recognize them at this level. You've got to not be in them yourself, because otherwise all you are doing is frantically trying to get yourself out of it. And you've got to know something about the journey back. This is no good just being able to say this is a traumatized system. You've got to actually be able to think, what do we do in the face of trauma? One of the things we're doing today, and we're relatively good at doing in certain circumstances, is to have a day of honouring the dead. We've acknowledged, in however ritualistic and insincere a way, we do acknowledge those people who've died in the service of looking after our country. And we're all wearing our poppies, and when we look at the poppies, we remember that hundreds of thousands of people have died trying to keep us safe. That's very, very important that we have that, because where it doesn't exist, veterans come back and they litter the country with the tragedy of their unacknowledged trauma. It's really disgraceful what happens to veterans. It probably still happens to veterans even now, but at least we have got some understanding that they need to be acknowledged, and that anybody who has gone into a world where they have witnessed death in these kinds of proportions carries a very special fate. They're no longer on the safe side of death in the way that we are. They're somewhere else. So developing our capacity to honour and respect and show compassion is incredibly important. If we do nothing else in the whole of our lives, being able to be somebody who can be turned to when there are almost unbearable things to face. You probably know in your lives who you would go to and who you wouldn't go to when something terrible had happened. And you want to go to someone who is big and steady enough in their heart to hold you while you grieve. That's what it seems to involve. So a lot of our preparatory work, a lot of why this work is so beautiful really, is that it is helping us grow a heart big enough for the work that's needed. And I think that's what we're doing right now, today, this morning. But the next bit also relates to storing context. So, and it's what we do a lot, of course, in constellations. We discover a symptom, somebody brings a symptom, and it doesn't make sense. It just looks like a traumatized, bizarre, irrational symptom. But as we restore the context, it begins to be an act of intelligence. And it begins to have the possibility of not being stuck in that particular way, because the context in which it arrived is now seen, and intelligent understanding and action is possible. So that's the kind of journey you're making really, which is to expand the place in which the trauma sits, whether it's historical trauma or personal trauma. But when people are themselves traumatized, and all of us have moments of this, or more than moments, there really are things that are known that make an almost immediate difference, and which I think all of us need to have in our kind of kit bag, our first aid kit, really. And the first is to be in community. So we have lived through the most isolated time of our lives over the last 18 months. We have not been in community very much. And you, I'm sure, have found your communities on Zoom, and if you're lucky, you've got somebody at home that you can cuddle, you know, and people you can wave to across the park. But on the whole, you have lost community massively. And so that sense of being held by collective suffering and collective strength and joy and being seen isn't very strong in us. And it makes us not know how to register the size of our problems. So if I'm very alone, I can get completely obsessed with something that's quite trivial, actually. As soon as I come into community, I can see that's not where it's at all. It just fades away. And so I think a lot of people during this lockdown have got obsessed with dissociated parts because they haven't yet been able to really feel that sense of I'm not alone. So again, it's just another thing that all of you wonderful people have to be wonderful at, which is almost immediately giving people a sense that they're not alone. It makes such a difference. Once that's possible, then you're thinking about what resources can we bring back. And when we're looking at trauma, whether it's collective or individual, because it comes out of inaction, comes out of freezing, the first return of health has to be action. So asking people who have just witnessed a bomb go off to run up and down on the spot and shout may look extremely weird thing to do, but actually it resets their neurology. It reminds them that they are people who can move and shout. And all the things that you love to do and know how to do that support chanting and singing and dancing and you know, controlled aggression like Tai Chi or Qigong, you know, all these things, they are always of helping the body and the soul go back to where it can act and where it can speak. And it can be done in quite a blunt way. It can be done in a room of 1,000 people. It doesn't have to be, you know, it doesn't have to be the sort of high quality one-to-one psychoanalytic business at all. After the tsunami, there were trauma people who went to the beaches in Thailand and so on, and they just got everybody shouting and moving. And the trauma came out of their body at that point, and they were then able to start doing the other things they needed to do. And of course, the next thing you need to do is some kind of ritual, because as you come out of trauma, as you begin to rebuild your resilience, you are a little bit like what Fiona was talking about, in a sort of void. You've been very identified with trauma. It's been part of your story and your definition and your excuse and your companion. And as you let go of some of it, you don't immediately have another identity. You often have a feeling you might like to scuttle back into that identity because you don't quite know what it is. So rituals of transition, rituals of waiting, and rituals of looking backwards and looking forwards and so on are very helpful. And those of you who are good at inventing activities for your clients will, I think, enjoy developing those kinds of rituals. And they nearly always involve reconnecting to the future, because when the human nervous system is overwhelmed, the amygdala basically runs everything in the brain, and the amygdala has a massive disadvantage for us, which is that it believes everything that's happening is in the present. It doesn't have a past tense. Things only move from the amygdala into the past tense at the point at which they can be gathered into the hippocampus and have this dimension of memory. When they're in the amygdala, it's not memory, it's actually happening now. So that's why we get flashbacks and so on. Whole countries get flashbacks. So the problem then is that there isn't a future. And many, many of us are in a way trying to live without a future, because what on earth is the future? What can we look forward to? What's going to happen to our children and our grandchildren? And what's going to, when we're building a garden, who's going to be looking after it when the trees are really, do you see what I mean? The whole sense of where we're taking things is very, very unclear. So the question of how to make a relationship with the future that has some way that we can welcome it and welcome ourselves in it, despite everything. It's a huge task. I'm not suggesting that any of these are simple things to do, but they are the known ways of restoring resilience at a time where trauma is kind of, it's like the echoes of trauma are ringing everywhere. My husband in his retirement has taken to building musical instruments, so that his room is full of absolutely ravishingly beautiful guitars and ukuleles and lutes and mandolins and so on. And if I go into the room and I pluck one string of one of them, you know what happens? They all reverberate all around the room. All they know. They say, "Ah, yes, boom," and then they do it. And sometimes, if we're having a row outside the room, they pick it up and they reverberate as well. So, in a way, what we're trying to do is listen to these reverberations, which of course go far, far back, and they go back into the slave ships, and they go back into the whole idea of empire, and they go back into the idea of progress that came once we started being settled human beings, which required us to believe that we could own things which we never did before, and so on. So it goes very, very far back. And we are beginning to have some confidence of a bigger map that will enable us not to solve anything, but to take next steps. And I'm pretty sure if you ask yourself, what has helped me in my latest, whatever it is, it's usually not that the entire problem went away. It's that you found the next step. And so the future wasn't a shut door anymore, but a place you could step into.